He was only 20 years old when fate stranded him on a world that seemed designed to break the spirit of any living being. The sun never softened its glare, and the ground was cracked into endless fissures, swallowing what little moisture dared exist. Days stretched long with blistering heat, and nights fell cold enough to steal breath from lungs. His survival was measured in sips from a failing canteen and mouthfuls of dry rations that dwindled faster than hope. Each morning, he woke to the knowledge that no rescue signal had yet been answered, and each night he lay on the parched ground wondering if he would open his eyes again. It was on one of those hopeless days that he first saw them. At first, he thought his mind had betrayed him, crafting illusions of figures from the rippling mirages across the desert horizon. But as he drew closer, reality set in. Two beings lay collapsed against the rocks, their forms fragile, their movements faint. Their skin carried a pale luminescence, faintly shimmering even in the harsh light, and their features were delicate, their large eyes clouded with exhaustion. He had no doubt they were not of his species, and for a moment he hesitated. His own supplies were barely enough to sustain him, perhaps not enough at all. Survival dictated selfishness, yet compassion demanded otherwise. Their breathing was shallow, their bodies trembling with weakness. Starvation and thirst had hollowed them out until they were little more than shadows clinging to life. He knelt beside them, torn between instinct and conscience, then unscrewed the cap of his canteen. The water inside was warm, metallic, and precious beyond value, but he tilted it carefully to their lips. One sip, then another. Their trembling slowed, their eyes flickered open, and in those dark pupils he saw gratitude mixed with disbelief. He broke apart a ration bar, pressing pieces into their hands, though each bite meant less strength for him in the days ahead. They ate slowly, reverently, as if consuming something sacred. When they could finally speak, their voices were soft and melodic, carrying accents shaped by a tongue foreign to human ears. Through fragmented words and gestures, he pieced together their story. They were sisters, stranded after a vessel failure, wandering the wasteland with nothing but will to guide them. Without his intervention, their journey would have ended in silence among the stones. When the worst of their hunger had eased, they looked to him with intensity that unsettled him. One sister traced a pattern across the dust with her finger, a spiral intersected by lines, and then pressed her hand against his arm. A faint glow spread across his skin, leaving behind a sigil that shimmered like cooled embers. The other sister mirrored the gesture, completing the mark. They spoke of a vow, a sacred law of their people. When a life was saved, a bond was forged. To them, debt was not transactional, it was eternal. He had given them water, food, and hope. In return, they had given him a promise that would transcend years and distance. He laughed softly at the notion, shaking his head, brushing it off as cultural ritual or perhaps delirium born from their ordeal. He had no desire for bonds or debts, only survival. Yet they bowed their heads in solemnity, speaking words in their native tongue that rang with finality. Though he could not understand the exact phrasing, he knew instinctively that a pact had been sealed, one they would not abandon. That night, they shared what little shelter he had fashioned. The desert winds howled against the fabric, but inside there was a fragile warmth, an unspoken trust. He watched as their breathing grew steady in sleep, and he wondered if he had done the right thing. Every calorie and drop he had given them shortened his own chances. But for the first time in days, he felt less alone beneath the alien sky. In the following morning, they departed. With strength renewed, they insisted they could continue their journey. Before leaving, they repeated their vow with voices firm and eyes unyielding. One sister touched the sigil glowing faintly on his arm, reminding him of the bond sealed between them. They promised they would return to fulfill it, though what fulfillment meant he could not grasp. Then, with grace returning to limbs that once trembled, they vanished into the horizon, leaving him staring after them with disbelief. For weeks afterward, he thought of them. The sigil remained on his skin, faint but undeniable, a constant reminder of the strange covenant. Yet survival pushed reflection aside. His rations ran lower, his body grew weaker, and his hope dwindled until the day rescue finally arrived. A recovery ship from Earth pulled him from the barren landscape, patching wounds and filling his stomach with real food. The crew asked about his time alone, and he spoke little. Telling them about luminous sisters and glowing sigils would sound like the ramblings of a sunstruck mind. He carried the memory in silence. Years passed. The mark on his arm dulled, but never faded. Sometimes he wondered if it had been real at all. Perhaps desperation had conjured the sisters, weaving fantasy into suffering. He built his life quietly, never speaking of what had happened, never expecting the vow to hold weight. What were two strangers on a forgotten world compared to the enormity of the galaxy? Surely they had forgotten him if they had ever existed at all. Yet in the quiet of night, he sometimes traced the faint spiral on his skin, feeling a pull he could not name. Somewhere in the depths of memory, he still saw their eyes, haunted, desperate, and alive because of him. A single act of compassion in a world of dust. And though he would not know it for decades, the promise they had spoken would one day return, reshaping his destiny and altering the course of two civilizations. 22 years passed, and the man who once wandered a hostile desert was no longer young. His hair carried threads of gray, his hands bore the calluses of ordinary labor, and his life was marked by simplicity rather than grandeur. He lived quietly, far from the centers of power, content in the rhythm of small routines. The sigil on his arm had faded to the faintest trace, almost invisible in daylight, yet never fully gone. He rarely thought of it anymore, dismissing it as a relic of youth, a strange memory with no consequence. The world, however, did not remain still. Humanity had advanced, expanding its presence beyond Earth, though cautiously, always aware of the greater forces lurking in the galaxy. Contact with alien species had been limited, tentative, and often strained. Mistrust ran deep, for every alliance seemed shadowed by hidden motives. Yet no one could have predicted the arrival that came one ordinary morning, tearing through the calm of the planet with a spectacle that could not be ignored. The sky split open as a colossal vessel entered orbit. Its design was unlike anything humans had ever catalogued, elegant, luminous, and vast enough to dwarf entire cities. The sudden presence threw governments into chaos, militaries into high alert, and billions into awe and fear. The news spread across every channel, every network, every device. Visitors had arrived, and they had come with purpose. Within hours, the vessel broadcast a message. Two figures stood at its forefront, broadcast into every corner of Earth. Time had transformed them, yet recognition came instantly. Their features were sharper, their bearing regal, their voices carrying authority. The alien sisters, no longer fragile survivors of a desert world, had become leaders of their people. They addressed humanity directly, their words translated with precision. They spoke not of conquest, nor trade, nor war, but of a vow made long ago. They declared that they had come to fulfill it, and they named the man who had once given them food and water as the reason for their journey. The world reeled. Governments demanded answers. Who was this man, and why had beings of such power crossed the stars for him? He was pulled from his quiet life and thrust into the glare of a world stage. Confusion surrounded him as officials interrogated him, seeking to understand the connection. Reluctantly, he confirmed what had happened. The barren desert, the starving sisters, the sigil, and their promise. He had never spoken of it publicly, never imagined it would resurface. Yet here it was, undeniable and inescapable. When he stood before them again, years fell away in an instant. The sisters gazed at him with the same intensity they once held, though now it was tempered by experience and command. They greeted him not as strangers, but as one bound by sacred law. Their people, they explained, recognized him as their bondmate, chosen by the vow of survival. To refuse would dishonor them, to accept would elevate him beyond comprehension. What had once seemed like a passing moment of kindness had become the foundation of destiny. Earth's leaders were not so easily convinced. The idea that two alien rulers sought to marry a human unsettled them deeply. Questions of motive loomed large. Was this a manipulation, a ploy to gain leverage over humanity, a trap cloaked in ritual? Or was it genuine, a cultural practice foreign yet binding? Meetings stretched long into nights, as diplomats debated whether the man should comply or resist. Some urged acceptance, seeing opportunity in alliance with such a powerful species. Others demanded rejection, fearing infiltration and loss of sovereignty. The man found himself caught between worlds. Once, his life had been marked by obscurity. Now, it was scrutinized by billions. He could not walk freely without cameras tracking his every step, could not speak without analysts dissecting his words. He felt the weight of suspicion pressing against him, yet he also saw the sincerity in the sisters' eyes. They had not forgotten him. For 2 decades, across the breadth of space, they had carried the memory of his kindness. And now they had returned, not as beggars of sustenance, but as sovereigns keeping their oath. The reunion was not without emotion. Though regal, the sisters spoke of their near-death struggle with a reverence that humbled him. They described how his water had tasted like life itself, how his food had given them the strength to walk again. They confessed that in their darkest hours, his face had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that compassion could exist even in the cruelest of places. Their rise to power, they said, had been guided by the memory of him. To them, his act had been more than survival, it had been sacred. Still, the situation was no simple matter of gratitude. Earth's military shadowed every meeting, and intelligence networks whispered of dangers. What if this vow was merely a means to claim Earth through ritual rather than war? What if binding him to them meant binding all of humanity under their authority? Fear and suspicion tangled with awe and wonder, leaving no room for clarity. The man himself was torn. He had never sought greatness, never craved recognition, yet now he was treated as a key to galactic fate. The sisters were patient yet firm. They spoke not of force, but of honor. Their people's traditions demanded fulfillment of the vow, and to break it would fracture the stability they had built. Their empire had been watching, waiting for this return, and they would not accept denial. The bond, they insisted, was not political to them. It was sacred truth, an oath tied to life and death. They had come not to claim a prize, but to restore balance to a promise. As days passed, the man found himself standing at the edge of a decision that reached beyond his comprehension. His ordinary life was gone, replaced by endless questions and demands. Humanity watched his every move, alien eyes measured his every word, and history itself seemed to pause, waiting for his choice. He had once shared water and food without thought of consequence. Now, the smallest gesture of compassion had become a fire that lit across worlds, drawing attention he neither wanted nor understood. And still, deep within, he knew the vow was real. He had seen their desperation, he had felt their gratitude, and he bore the mark of their promise still faintly glowing on his skin. They had come back for him, across time and distance, carrying not only their survival, but their people's honor. What had begun as a fleeting act in a barren desert was now a destiny pressing upon him, demanding resolution. He had never considered himself a man of consequence. Yet now every faction, every government, and every watching eye treated him as though he were the pivot upon which entire civilizations turned. The sisters' vow was no longer a private memory, but a matter of galactic significance. Their empire regarded him as sacred, Earth regarded him as suspicious, and he regarded himself as trapped between impossible choices. What had once been an act of instinctive kindness was now a question of destiny. In the days that followed their return, he was brought deeper into understanding the culture that bound them. Through interpreters and patient explanation, the sisters described the law of life-debt that their people revered. To give life when death was certain created a bond no authority could override. It was not transaction, it was sanctity. To them, he was not simply the man who had shared food and water, he was the one who had touched their survival itself. Their people had elevated his act into legend, teaching generations that compassion was more powerful than power itself. By their traditions, his refusal would not only dishonor them, but also destabilize their rule. His acceptance, however, would signify an unbreakable bridge between humanity and their empire. The burden of such knowledge pressed heavily upon him. Earth's leaders met with him in chambers thick with tension, urging him to consider consequences beyond himself. If he accepted, humanity might become dependent on an alien empire, perhaps subjugated under the guise of alliance. If he rejected, it could provoke insults strong enough to spark war. Diplomats presented him with lists of risks, generals spoke in threats of invasion, and strategists outlined decades of uncertainty. Every word framed him as either the salvation or the downfall of his species, yet none of them spoke of him as a man. The sisters countered with gentleness, but no less gravity. They reminded him of the night in the desert, when he had no guarantee of survival, yet still gave what he had. They argued that his act had proven the core of humanity, kindness even when costly. They spoke of how their rise to leadership had been shaped by that memory, how every decision they made was guided by the example of compassion he had shown. To them, this was not politics, it was destiny fulfilled. Their voices carried sincerity, their eyes a devotion that was neither feigned nor strategic. They were bound to him, not for leverage, but for truth. He began to see how both sides misunderstood one another. Earth saw only risk, interpreting the vow as manipulation. The alien people saw only honor, interpreting hesitation as insult. And he, caught in the middle, wrestled with doubts that kept him awake through long nights. He had no wish to be anyone's pawn, yet neither could he ignore the weight of the promise. The mark on his arm, faint but persistent, seemed to burn with every thought. The more he listened, the more he understood the sisters' vulnerability. Despite their power, their entire legitimacy was intertwined with the vow. To return without fulfilling it would undermine them, perhaps fracture their empire. Rivals waited in shadows, eager to seize weakness, and whispers spread that if the human rejected them, their reign would collapse. His choice was not just about marriage, it was about stability for millions who looked to them as rulers. On Earth, public debate raged. Some hailed him as a symbol of human greatness, living proof that even the smallest act of kindness could command respect across the stars. Others accused him of weakness, fearing that one man's compassion had ensnared humanity into chains disguised as devotion. Commentators, politicians, and scientists dissected his past, questioning his motives, doubting his story. Every word he had spoken 22 years ago now became evidence or weapon in arguments far beyond his control. In private moments, he spoke with the sisters directly. They asked nothing of him but choice. They never threatened, never coerced. They only repeated their vow, reaffirming it with patience. They told him that his humanity was not small in their eyes, but vast, because in a place where survival demanded selfishness, he had chosen generosity. He listened, uncertain of his strength, yet recognizing truth in their words. It became clear that no one could decide for him. No council, no government, no empire. The responsibility lay solely on his shoulders, and in that realization came both dread and clarity. He thought back to that barren desert, when death loomed over them all, and the choice he made was instinctive, not strategic. He had not calculated alliances or measured power. He had simply seen two lives slipping away and could not stand by. That moment, simple and unadorned, was the essence of who he was. The choice before him now demanded the same honesty. He was not a politician, not a general, not a strategist. He was only a man who once gave water to the thirsty, food to the starving, and hope to the hopeless. The galaxy had chosen to make that act into legend, but to him it remained something pure. What mattered was not fear of war or promise of power, but whether he could deny the truth of the bond he had forged. The sisters' words echoed in his mind. To refuse would wound their people, to accept would heal them. His own people, however, trembled at the uncertainty of both. For nights unending, he weighed the scales. Fear pressed heavy, Yet beneath it was the undeniable memory of their eyes in the desert, wide with desperation, lit with gratitude. He had once given them life. Could he now take it away with denial? In the end, he realized that the weight of his choice was not only about politics or species, but about the meaning of humanity itself. If kindness could echo across decades and stars, then to betray it now would unravel everything he had once stood for. The bond was more than ritual. It was proof that one human act could ripple into destiny. His decision would soon be made, and when it came, it would not be out of fear or pressure, but from the same truth that guided him long ago, compassion above all. When the time came for him to speak, the world held its breath. Broadcasts carried his image across Earth and far beyond, reaching not only human cities but alien worlds waiting to hear whether a promise made in the dust of a forgotten desert would be fulfilled or broken. He stood before the weight of expectation, aware that whatever words left his lips would ripple into futures unseen. He thought of his youth, the barren sky, the 2 lives he once touched without hope of reward. He thought of the decades since, lived in obscurity, never imagining such a moment. Now destiny had placed him at the heart of 2 civilizations. His decision was not drawn from councils or treaties. It was not the product of strategy or fear. It was born from memory, from the sight of 2 starving figures who had looked at him with eyes that begged for life. He spoke with calm conviction, declaring that he would honor the vow. Not because of politics, not because of pressure, but because kindness was not meant to be abandoned when it became difficult. Compassion, he said, must endure even when the cost is high, or it is no compassion at all. The reaction was immediate. Earth trembled with divided voices, some crying betrayal, others crying triumph. The alien empire, however, roared with approval, their faith in their rulers vindicated. The sisters bowed before him, not as conquerors claiming a prize, but as equals acknowledging a bond that transcended cultures and time. The sigil on his arm flared once more, brighter than it had in decades, sealing the vow that had waited 22 years for its fulfillment. Yet the choice did not end with personal acceptance. His union with them redefined the relationship between species. It was not a surrender of humanity, but a demonstration of its strength. By embracing the bond freely, he placed humans not beneath, but beside their empire. Negotiations followed, not dictated by fear of invasion, but by mutual recognition that the smallest act of generosity could shape a foundation stronger than armies. His presence ensured balance. Humanity would not vanish into subjugation, nor would the alien empire appear weak before its rivals. Instead, the bond became symbol and shield alike. He came to understand that the sisters had not sought to ensnare him, nor to use him as a pawn. Their devotion was genuine, rooted in the moment when survival had been given to them by his hand. They spoke of how his act had guided their rise, how it had reminded them, even as rulers, never to abandon mercy. To them, he was not simply a partner, but a living reminder of why power must serve compassion. And as he listened, he found within himself not reluctance, but a quiet acceptance that this was not a burden, but a fulfillment. Earth adapted in ways no one expected. The fear of conquest faded as the bond proved not to weaken humanity, but to elevate it. Trade opened, knowledge was shared, and distrust softened. The idea that one man's kindness had built this bridge became a story told again and again, reshaping how both species viewed themselves and each other. Where once there had been suspicion, there now grew cooperation. Where once there had been fear of domination, there now bloomed recognition of shared values. For him, life transformed. He was no longer the obscure man who had lived in solitude, yet he did not seek grandeur. He carried himself with the same quiet humility he had always known. The sisters walked beside him not as rulers binding him to their empire, but as companions bound by truth. Together they demonstrated that unity did not require conquest, that honor did not demand chains, and that destiny could be rewritten by a choice as simple as sharing water in a desert. In private reflection, he often thought back to the moment of decision. He realized that history would remember his choice as monumental, yet to him, It was still the same as it had been 22 years earlier. The desert had offered him a chance to act, and he had acted without hesitation. The same instinct had guided him now. Nothing had changed, except that the galaxy had been watching. He did not see himself as a savior or symbol, only as a man who chose not to let another die when he could prevent it. That truth was enough. As years passed, the vow remained strong. The sisters ruled with wisdom, strengthened by the bond they had honored. Humanity stood not as subordinate, but as ally. Their voice carried further than ever before. Conflicts still rose, challenges still loomed, yet the foundation built on compassion endured. And whenever doubt surfaced, people remembered the story of the young man who gave his last water to strangers and how that act had echoed across the stars. In his final reflections, he understood the lesson that had always been there. Greatness is not measured by power, nor by fear, but by the courage to act with compassion when nothing compels it. He had not set out to shape destiny, yet destiny had been shaped by him because he chose mercy over survival. The galaxy did not bow to him. Instead, it stood changed by what he represented. The promise had been fulfilled, not through conquest or bargain, but through the simple truth that humanity's greatest strength is the will to see life preserved, even at personal cost. And in that fulfillment, two species found a new path forward, bound not by chains but by choice. The desert had been barren, but from it had grown a bond more enduring than any empire, a bond written not in treaties, but in the language of kindness. And so, the story closed where it had begun, with a human offering sustenance to the desperate, and the desperate offering a vow. The act had been small, the promise unremarkable at the time, but its echo resounded through decades and across the stars, proving that sometimes a single moment of compassion is enough to carry the weight of civilizations.